G'day everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Bianca and the organisers at Open Banking Week for the opportunity to be here with you all, albeit virtually. I think all of us are really looking forward to one of these days when we're all together in the one place and we can celebrate all of the great work that we're doing. We can challenge one another, we can support one another, and have a few laughs. That would be lovely. Today I'm here to talk to you about open banking versus reality. It's an interesting topic. What do I mean? Well, in this specific context, I am referring to some of the fundamental assumptions upon which open banking ecosystems around the world have been built, specifically those that relate to the way that individual actors, consumers in this case, are likely to behave in the context of data sharing, often consent-based data sharing. But before we do that, let me give you a tiny little bit of background about me. I've spent most of my career helping leaders and practitioners design products and services for the qualities of trustworthiness. And because of the way that so many organizations now operate, a huge component, a huge part, a huge focus of my career has been applied ethics in tech, responsible innovation, data ethics, privacy, data protection, consent-based data sharing, all of these different interconnected and interrelated issues. Specifically, in the context of open banking, I've had the fortune of working with the open banking implementation entity, with the consumer data right, here in Australia, as a result of direct work with the DSB, the Data Standards Body. Our models, for instance, for consent-based data sharing, codification of consent, which is now starting to happen in the UK, have become really foundational to the way that many of these ecosystems are developing. And I would argue that they're going nowhere near far enough. And we will do our best to continue pushing folks to do better. I've actually designed this presentation in such a way that you can interact with it. So if you see an image, it's likely that you can click on it. It will open a new tab in the browser that you're viewing this from within. And I've designed it in such a way, or designed it that way, to try and encourage folks who are interested to dive deeper into these topics. With that said, let's do just that. I want to start by talking a little bit about trust, generally, and then we'll get a little more specific. Trust is often thought of as being a somewhat binary relational or relationship state. You either trust or you don't. We sort of get that there's more nuance intuitively, but in a lot of cases, the nuance, the ambiguity, and the complexity of trust seems to be poorly understood. And as a result, organizations around the world, ecosystems around the world, are failing to design for the qualities of trustworthiness. Now, if you are interested in diving much deeper into this topic, I can highly recommend TIGTech's latest work. Hilary Sutcliffe and the team there have done a wonderful job. Just click on the visual that you see and you'll be taken directly to that report. But what about in the specific context of trust and people's propensity to share data? Let's zoom in as a starting point to some 2014 research from Ipsos Mori for the Royal Society. What they observed in this body of research was that there is in fact a difference between brand trust and data trust, the trust that an individual places in an organization's data practices. And in most cases, this was back in 2014, in most cases, data trust was lower than brand trust, which is not good. Organizations need this information to operate effectively, to deliver competitive and valuable or meaningful propositions to the broad and diverse group of stakeholders they serve. So why might this be the case? Well, it's probably pretty obvious in some ways, but let's play around with the question anyways. This comes from the 2019 Pew Privacy Study. I'm going to read this out. Americans and privacy: concerned, confused and feeling a lack of control over their personal information. Now, in work that we've done over the last few years, for instance, our Day in the Life of Data with the Consumer Policy Research Centre, what we consistently observe is a mental model that goes something like this. I interact with a product or service or with an organisation. I feel powerless. I don't believe I have any agency. I don't believe I can influence the outcome of the experience that I'm interacting with. As a result, I become somewhat apathetic. My apathy behaviorally translates to not caring. And this is often observed in the context of things like upfront terms and conditions experiences. Or let's pick a really useful one here, cookie consent notices. Bit of an oxymoron in some ways, but let's just talk about it. What do you do? Think about it. What do you do? How do you behave when you see a cookie consent notice? Do you take the time to dive into the granular detail to understand which parties are gaining access to your data, which tools are being used, the trade-offs that the organisation that you're interacting with has made in order to implement this given experience? No, not at all. You do something that we refer to as the agreement bypass bias, a learned behaviour, whether it's a distinct behavioural phenomenon, we aren't sure. It could be explained by other cognitive biases that are perhaps better understood based on the existing literature. You actively bypass the agreement without giving it much thought, right? Now, this isn't because you trust. It's because you feel powerless, you've become apathetic. That behaviourally translates to not giving a... You get the picture. Now, fast forwarding a little bit to some more recent research from Frontier Economics and the Open Data Institute, what we can observe here, and this was in a reasonably confined environment, but it was a wonderful study and it is worth referencing, is a direct relationship between trust and the propensity that people have to willingly share data. Now, in the context in which we operate, which are often more nuanced, a specific product or service or a specific component of a product or service, we've been able to demonstrate 8 times uplift in the propensity that people have to willingly share relative to baseline. So huge uplift when we engage in more progressive, more trustworthy practices that enable people to, over time, enhance the quality of the relationship they have with an organization, deepen that relationship through mutual information exchanges. And as a result of that, one of the behaviors we observe is an uplift in people's willingness to happily share information that relates to them. So if this is the case, if there is this data trust deficit or gap, and if it's likely that between 2014 and 2021, this gap has widened, I think that's a reasonable assumption. The research has not been replicated recently, but I think it's a reasonable assumption. We must be asking, well, what do we do? I hope you're asking that. That's certainly what I'm asking. I spend a lot of my days thinking about this. And Baroness O'Neill, has a wonderful TED talk on this topic, and I'm just going to read this succinct quote. The first step is to be trustworthy. Notice the distinction, focusing on trustworthiness and not trust. We'll come back to that. The second step is to show evidence that we are trustworthy. That's powerful. What do we mean by that, right? Again, coming back to the TIG Tech work that I referenced, there are these 7 signals, qualities, virtues of trustworthiness. You might think about them slightly different ways. We have intent, acting in the public's interest. We have competence, we have respect, we have openness, we have integrity, we have fairness, we have inclusion. Openness and transparency, obviously related. Why does it make sense to focus on these signals of trustworthiness? There are lots of different reasons. If you were to focus, for instance, in the context of designing an open banking ecosystem on these 7 signals of trustworthiness, you could categorize them, you could break them down into their component parts, and you could define specific actions and measurement infrastructure, key metrics to determine how effectively you are performing in any of these categories, these signals of trustworthiness, as a result of first identifying them. If you are to try and design for trust, which is a variable outcome that you can influence, but remember, trust is given to you, right? You can argue it's earned to an extent, but it's given to you. You cannot control it, right? But you have far more influence on the ecosystems, or in this particular case, if you represent an organization, a distinct organization participating in open banking somewhere around the world, you can define these qualities or signals of trustworthiness. You can break them down into component parts. You can define specific actions. You can embed specific measurement infrastructure. And you can progress towards consistently and systematically enhancing these qualities of trustworthiness. And what can you do as a result of that? Well, you can pretty safely assume that you will become more trusted. There's some variance there, but you can pretty safely assume that you will become more trusted. Now, let's get a little bit more granular, a little bit more focused. Back in 2019, when we were hired in Australia by the data standards body for different projects, but the second of which looked at the notion of consent management and revocation. And we conducted a body of research to try and understand how people might behave. Really important, right? A lot of this stuff is super speculative. It lacks sort of inherent empiricism. We are making a bunch of assumptions when we design these ecosystems. They're pretty exclusive by design. Like, when was the last time that actual representatives of these democratic societies that we're designing these open banking ecosystems for actively participated in the design of the ecosystem in the first place? The answer is never. So let's be clear on that, but I will move on. That's probably a topic for another discussion. What we were able to demonstrate in this research, which we can't assign any considerable confidence to because it's in a lab setting, we're talking about simulating a specific situational context and observing proxy behaviors, right? This is not like a randomized control trial of sorts. So keep that in mind. But what we were able to simulate when we looked at the way that open banking, in this particular case, the consumer data right, was being proposed versus a model that we designed, which was more inherently consumer-centric, where instead of individuals having many, many dashboards from which to potentially interact with data sharing events, they had one centrally accessible dashboard. There's a lot of technical detail to support that, and if you're interested, reach out to me. We can share that with you. We were able to demonstrate significant uplift in the intentionality with which people actively shared their information. It's a really important insight, and arguably it's yet to be acted upon. Hence why I said at the start, we've got a long way to go. Now, when it comes to consent, consent's a tricky issue. Is consent feasible given the way the world now works? That's an open question, but I would argue that it is highly flawed in a variety of different ways. Now, as many of us know, PSD2 consent and GDPR consent are different, but in many cases in different jurisdictions around the world, the spirit of consent is reasonably consistent. What we're effectively proposing is that people are presented with accurate, timely information and that they are able to make an informed choice without detriment. Right? Those are the basic conditions at the highest level. We're talking about the flying through the sky at 38,000 foot right here. But what can we do near immediately to improve this process? Number one, we can conduct more rigorous research. We can engage with behavioral scientists to conduct randomized control trials where we actually put different ways of presenting a consent-based data sharing experience to the test. We can utilize insights from the behavioral sciences, from human-centered design and from traditional legal practice, and do something like better disclosure, where we utilize different information design patterns to increase the likelihood that people understand. We can prioritize different metrics, like instead of optimizing for positive consent, which if you do that, by the way, means it's not consent at all. Again, maybe an issue for another time. We optimize for whether or not the action is informed. We try and decrease the time it takes to take that informed action without muddying the waters, so to speak, without limiting people's ability to understand and to act. And we recognize that much of what we're proposing does not map to reality. We are proposing people are informed and actively and willingly share their data. That is not how data sharing works today. Data sharing is passive, it is pervasive. We are constantly under surveillance. We feel apathetic. That behaviorally translates to not giving a, remember, you can insert the expletive. What I'd like to do is wrap up by inviting you, all of you, I know there's thousands of you watching this, to join us on the journey. By us, I mean a community of practice, practitioners and leaders from all around the world, connecting, collaborating in a highly coordinated manner to ask and answer these tricky, these challenging questions that we are asking all around the world in digital society. Again, thank you so much for being here with me today. Thank you, Bianca and the team at Open Banking Week, for the opportunity. I'm excited to connect and to interact with a bunch of you over the coming months and over the coming years. Bye for now.